All right, so we've been talking about the basic Buddhist teachings, and we started out talking about the Buddha's path to enlightenment and the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and then getting into the four marks of existence, or the four seals of the Dharma, depending on which tradition's translation or version of these that you're looking at. And so this is, after the Buddha gave his talk, setting the wheel of Dharma in motion, talking about the Four Noble Truths, laying out the middle way, the Eightfold Path. And then he talked about impermanence. And then he talked about this one, which is the doctrine of not self. Now, you'll hear this referred to in a lot of different ways. I've seen egolessness. I've seen no self. You'll hear people say, oh, Buddhists believe that there's not a self. It's not quite accurate. What the Buddha really said is that, generally speaking, what we think of as a self isn't. Okay? Didn't say there's not one, didn't say there is one, but what we think of as our self generally is not. And there's no self as such. In other words, there's no essence that we can look at and say this is self. So let me tell you what the Buddha said to the monks there in Sarnath outside of Varanasi. He said, monks, form is not self. Were form self, then this form would not lead to affliction. One could have it of form, let my form be thus, let my form be not thus. But since form is not self, so it leads to affliction, and none can have it of form, let my form be thus, let my form be not thus. In other words, this body, because it's a compounded thing, because it's made up of other things that are all subject to change, I can't say this is mine. If I could say that this was mine, then I would have some control over it. I could make myself taller. I can guarantee you I'd make myself younger and better looking. But it's not mine. It's made up really of a set of processes that are constantly ongoing and constantly changing, and that are made up of things that are not me. So when I walked in the door here, I was convinced that there were certain molecules that were mine. You would say, is that your body? Yeah, that's my body. But then as I sit here and breathe, there are molecules that are no longer me, and some of them are you now. Right? And vice versa. And there's combustion going on in the cells. There's all these changes happening. So even in the last 20 minutes since I got here to the church, this body has changed. And things that were mine are in a different form or even not part of me anymore. So, because it's this compounded thing, because it's subject to change, because it's not mine, it's ultimately unsatisfactory. Okay. So then he goes on and he says, monks, feeling is not self. Perception is not self. Mental fabrications are not self. Consciousness is not self. In other words, he's describing what they call in Pali, the language of ancient Buddhism, khandha. There are 5 khandha, or skandhas, depending on whether you're talking Pali or Sanskrit. And basically the word translates more or less as heaps. We'll refer to usually as aggregates. So what we think of as a self is made up of these 5 aggregates of things that are constantly in change. So there's feeling. Feeling meaning physical sensation and sort of sensation of the heart, mental sensations. And these are either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Okay, so you're sitting and meditating, you get a cramp that causes a sensation, probably an unpleasant one. You're sitting in meditation, you enter a jhana, you get this sort of full body blissful feeling. That's a pleasant one. There's a lot of other things like that. So, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This is kind of important because we'll talk about it in meditation later on. And then perceptions. Basically kind of memories of things we've seen before and understanding of what they are. So stuff Comes in our eyes, there's contact, I see something, I know what it is. That's perception. It's the form and mind's engagement in this contact. All right? So perceptions of sight, sound, smells, taste, touch, and things that arise in the mind. And then mental formations, mental fabrications, sankhara. And these are kind of how we feel about the things that we perceive. Attitudes, states of mind. Anger arises, that's a mental formation. Compassion arises, that's a mental formation. Boredom arises, that's a mental formation. In other words, all these things come in the mind and we see them and we recognize them and then we react to them in some way. Okay? And awareness, in other words, knowledge of what's happening. Knowledge of what I'm seeing, knowledge of what I'm feeling, knowledge of what's happening in my states of mind. Okay? So those 5 things are what make up what we think of as a self. And those 5 things are constantly in change. So we tend to think of ourself as being kind of a discrete thing. And in the Buddhist day, they had this concept of the Atman, kind of the self. And there was the big self of God, and there was the inner self that was one's essence. And basically the Buddha said that he meditated on this and he couldn't find that. He said he looked at form and self wasn't in there. He looked at feeling and self wasn't in there. None of those things were mine. So what we think of as a discrete thing really is a lot more like a wave on the ocean. And a wave is made up of things that are form, water and salt and bits of seaweed and whatever happens to be in that wave. And it's made up of things that are not form, that are more energies. The pull of the moon, the action of the wind on the water, and that sort of thing. And that creates a wave that's moving through the ocean. Now, if you're a surfer riding that wave, you think, oh, this is a wave. This wave is a discrete thing. If you could see the world from the wave's point of view, you would certainly probably feel like, oh, I'm a wave and this is me. But if you were to get a big scoop and take that wave out of the water somehow, you wouldn't have a wave anymore. You couldn't separate all of those things that make up the wave and still have a wave. You just have a bucket full of water. And so what we think of as us is really more like that. It's more like something constantly in motion and constantly relating to other things, reacting to other things. So we were talking last week about Kenneth Tanaka's mnemonic about the 4 seals of the Dharma, the big, B-I-I-G. Said the first one is, the B stands for bumpy. Life is a bumpy road. That's the truth of dukkha, the truth of suffering. There's always going to be some bumps in there. And the second one was impermanence. Everything's going to change. Life is impermanent. The third one then is interdependency. And this is where the teaching of not self comes in. Everything is interdependent. Just like you can't take that wave out of the ocean, you can't take this self out of everything that it's connected to and still have the same thing. Make sense? Okay, so what does all this mean? I've been saying repeatedly, these things are not just abstract ideas. We don't just believe in them. We put these things into practice, and we do this in order to transcend our suffering. So how does this understanding of the self affect whether or not I suffer? How do I use this idea of the self to create stress? How do I use a new idea of the self to transcend stress? Well, generally, we're looking at a pattern within this, as I've just explained, highly involved and complicated set of constantly changing patterns. And we're saying, that's me, right? And so there's a fallacy there then. Because if I'm looking at something stupid that I just did, and I'm saying, that's me, then what about all the bazillion things that I've done that weren't stupid? Okay. At the same token, if I look at someone else, and I say based on something that they did that I happen to not like, they're a bad person. Then it's the same kind of thing. I'm overgeneralizing a very complex organism and saying that's bad, or I'm bad. Right? So, as I said, this thing that we call a self is subject to a lot of causes and conditions. And one of those causes and conditions is the law of karma. Karma means action. The previous action and current action is willful action. If I do a good thing, I get a good result. If I do a bad thing, I get a bad result. So when we start looking at the self, and we go, where did this self start? Well, myself, I could say, well, this self started on, about 2 a.m. on February 5th, 1956. But there was stuff there before that, right? There was a certain amount of form that was in process before then. So maybe, I hope my mother doesn't watch this video. Maybe this self started on a fishing trip, to Port Aransas about 9 months earlier than that, okay? But, I had parents, right? So when you take into account the form and the feelings and the mental fabrications, the perceptions, all these things, and go, where did all this start? Then you come to this idea of beginningless time. There's a whole lot of karma had to happen. A whole lot of action had to occur before this particular self could be sitting here talking to you in DeLand, Florida, on February 12th, 2014. Right? So, we can look then and say, okay, so this thing that I am is subject to, has inherited a lot of karma. This thing that I am is also creating karma, right? So what's going to determine where that wave goes after this point is, to some extent, the choices that I make. And if I make good choices, it's going to go someplace good. If I make bad choices, it's going to go someplace bad. Now, we tend to create stress, as I said, by basically identifying something and saying that this is our self, or this is someone else's self, and then rating it as good or bad or indifferent or whatever, based on how we feel about it. The idea of self, to me, for a long time, just seemed like kind of an abstraction. This whole, you'd read these books about Zen, and they would talk about there not being a self and all that kind of stuff, and it would seem really kind of cool, but so what? And then one day, I was way back in the late 80s, early 90s, I was attending a recovery group meeting, Rational Recovery, and they used Albert Ellis's teachings as an alternative to the 12 steps for people who are getting over drug and alcohol issues. And we had an advisor who was working there with us, and he was a psychologist. And this woman started talking, and she said something about, I don't remember, she felt really bad about something, and this psychologist, Philip, said, why do you think you feel bad about that? And she said, well, I guess I have low self-esteem. And he said, well, what do you think would be the solution to that? Well, I think I should have high self-esteem. And he said, what would you say if I said self-esteem was a sickness? And it was like my head exploded. It was like, I got it all of a sudden. Oh, it's weird. It's like wrong. It's sick to esteem something that's constantly changing, that's not really there, that doesn't have that kind of substance that we can look at it and go, oh yes, it's good or bad. Right? And so, and by the same token, when we feel anger towards someone else, we're feeling anger towards something that's not real, that's constantly changing, that has a lot of aspects to it that really aren't in that particular moment. So, so when we start looking at how we create things like anxiety, depression, worry, all that kind of stuff, usually we're creating a pattern of self around something. And we do it when we're meditating. I know I've had probably 100 people come up to me and say, "Oh, I can't meditate. I'm not any good at meditating. I sit down and try to calm my mind. My mind's just all over the place. I'm no good at this." In other words, they're taking one meditation experience or one thing and saying, I'm not any good at that. I'm not any good. So we kind of start looking at how you're engaging this idea of a self in your meditation practice. And then look at how you're engaging this idea of a self when you're not meditating. Look and see things like perfectionism. You know, perfectionism is the idea that I have to be perfect. Well, which I is it that has to be perfect? You know, things like anxiety. Oh, I might fail and that would be horrible. Well, again, which I would suffer miserably because of your failure? You know, where is this I that can't fail? I don't think that changes the overall idea about the self versus not self too much. You know, the way he described perception is really you look at the form and the formless, right? And when those two things come in contact, then we say that there's perception. Does that make sense? Okay, so, you know, light comes in the eye, and the mind becomes aware of that through the process of the brain and the optic nerve and all that kind of stuff. So even though we know kind of physically what happens with the form, in terms of the way we use that once we've got it, I don't think it changes too much. Does that make sense? And yeah, and there's an interesting video series called The Religious Brain, where it talks a lot about that kind of stuff, and you know what parts of the brain light up when you see certain things and that kind of thing. And so, but in terms of how you deal with the information you're getting and how you use it to create stress for yourself versus not creating stress for yourself, I think it's kind of the same process, even though mechanically what might be happening in the brain is different than what the Buddha would have ever imagined. I think in terms of what we do with it is the same. Now, we know, for example, now that you can create new neural pathways and that sort of thing. So we might be able to explain that, well, what we're doing now is we're going to take this information, work with it differently, and create a different neural path. Still kind of ended up the same place. So. Yeah, and let me just kind of add something to that. So that's a good perception that there's sort of a pile of mental fabrications, basically, attitudes, judgments, all those kinds of things. And so you look at it and go, well, which ones of these led to stress? Which ones of these didn't? We tend to rate ourselves. And then we tend, when we see that there's a problem with that, we tend to want to not rate or not judge. In fact, you even find some Dharma teachers who say, well, you shouldn't judge anything. I kind of disagree with that. Okay. Because, you know, the Buddha said, I divided my thoughts into two parts. There was this part over here that led to stress and suffering, and then there was this part over here that didn't. So this part was unskillful, this part was skillful. I said, well, let me go away with these. So yeah, you can sort through that pile of thoughts that you've got and go, these take me where I want to go, these don't. Okay. And if you put that in contemporary psychological terms, you know, somebody like Albert Ellis or Aaron Beck might say, well, this is, you know, a rational belief. It makes sense in terms of the way things really are. It doesn't it doesn't create anger and inappropriate emotional reactions and that sort of thing. And you know, it moves me forward. This thought here, even though I cling to it, even though I like my anger or whatever, even though it's fun to cling to this idea, it actually defeats me. It actually keeps me from getting where I want to go. So yeah, so that's a good thought. Yes. Awareness is knowledge of what's happening. See? A lot of the times when we know what's going on, but we're not being real discerning with how we're using our awareness. And so you might be thinking about how he didn't take out the trash again. And you're just going through all of these reasons why he's really a bad guy because he never takes out the trash, and then you start thinking about all the other things that he never does, all that kind of stuff, right? I don't know. He looks like the kind of guy who probably does take out the trash, but I'm just using that as But so your awareness is on basically the past, and maybe a little bit of the future. He always does this, so he's always going to do that. He's just going to be a bad guy forever. Right? Instead, shift your awareness to what you're doing. And then you can look and go, oh, look at all this anger I'm creating. Right? So when you shift your attention from the external or from the past and future to what's really happening in the present moment, then you get a different story. And so yes, the answer to your question is it's about how you use your attention. And I'll say it again, your experience of life and yourself and the other people around you has very little to do with what happens to you and almost everything to do with where you put your attention.